The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Lunch and Learn, and warm welcome to wherever you are in Queensland and local government, and look forward to working with you over the next 1 hour. And I just remind people, I just want to make sure I'm being heard, so could you just click on the question box over there on the right hand side, and just, if you wouldn't mind, please type in clear. That'll help me realise that I'm thank you, Rob. Yep. Good. Thank you, Mary. Thanks, Janice. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, John. Thanks, Tracy. All clear. Brilliant. Okay. That's good to know. So I'll continue. And thanks, Edward. And what we'll do at the end of this, of course, is I'll send you the slides, I'll send you the presentation, and so just relax and enjoy yourself for the next hour on this topic of the roles people play in teams. So let's get underway. Just as a bit of revision, you'll recall last time we worked together, I think the big theme that came out of last time was this business of whether you're more task related or task focused or more relationship focused. And I shared with you a number of models around that. And the whole idea of that was to make sure that you've got task and relationship in balance, because obviously in any team you've got a task that has to be achieved. So clearly you've got to have your eye on the task. But you won't achieve anything unless you work with and through other people to achieve the result, certainly not in any sustainable way. So, and of course, certain circumstances require you to be very task focused, and other circumstances require you to be very relationship focused. And you just need to know when to swing the pendulum one way or the other. And so I hope you've had some fun with that, and I hope you've had a chance to think carefully about whether you have the right balance around task and relationship in relation to the work that you perform as a leader in your team. So that was pretty much the essence of what we did last time. So we'll leave that and move on to, as I say, the roles that people play in teams. So when you look at the Lunch and Learn, just to do a quick recap, we did talk about the characteristics of high-performing teams, and you might recall that there were 8 characteristics. There may well be more than 8 characteristics, but there were certainly 8 that I talked about, and your homework there was to actually go away and apply 1 or 2 of those characteristics to your teams. And the good news was that with the model that I shared with you, if you could improve some of the characteristics in your team, it likely would affect positively other characteristics in the team. So I hope you've had an opportunity to do something in that area. In Unit 2, we looked at the 4 stages of team development, and that was drawing upon Bruce Tuckman's team development model to really say that all teams go through 4 cycles before they get to the performance phase, which of course is the ultimate phase in a team. So I hope you've had a chance to observe some of the teams that you're involved in and have worked with, and have consideration around which stage is this team in, and as a leader, what can I do in order to move this team on to the next stage? So, it was very much around awareness. In Unit 3, we looked at tools of team leadership. As I mentioned before, it was very much around the notion of relationship and task and balancing those things up. And of course, I shared with you about half a dozen models around that. So most good team leaders are acutely aware that relationship is important, and also, of course, task is important, and both of those things are important. So today we look at the roles that people play in teams and spend a bit of time, and I'm going to draw upon the work of team management systems, which is one that I use quite regularly, but I'll draw upon that because it's one of the best illustrations of team roles that I know of, and one that can be very, very effective. So I'll spend time talking about that. So, in fact, there are three things that I will be covering in our session today. And the first thing is that I'm going to share with you 8 team tasks or 8 team roles that people play. And while I'm going through those, you might like to consider, well, which of those roles or tasks do I naturally feel comfortable with, notwithstanding my position as the team leader? And perhaps you might then think about some of the people that you lead and think about where their orientation is when they're working with you and others in a team environment. I then want to share with you 4 concepts: relationships, information, decisions, and organisation. And I want to talk about each of those because each of those have important elements to them in relation to working out what people's team roles are. And then I want to share with you how you might be able to profile a team and to actually look at some of the strengths and opportunities for growth in a team based on team roles. Now, the concept of people in teams having a particular role comes from the work of Professor Meredith Belbin. Meredith, incidentally, is a male. Meredith Belbin was the very first scholar, if you like, who came up with the idea that people, when they get together, congregate together in teams, will mostly subconsciously play a particular role. And so his research demonstrated conclusively that there were a number of roles that people played. And of course, other people, such as the team management systems, have decided to take his work to the next level and start to look at what some of those roles are. And now you can get profiles and work that out very easily by people doing an online assessment. And what it does is it produces a fairly detailed report, and you can work out, what people's roles are. And of course, you can put all of those roles together and develop what we call a team profile. So you can see what roles are missing, what roles are dominating, and it tells a lot about the personality of a team. It can be very interesting and insightful. So Belbin was the first one to come up with that concept. Now, it's kind of like if we all landed on a desert island today. Let's say that we're all sitting around the campfire. We're on a desert island, and we've probably got 2 concerns on our mind. We've been shipwrecked there, and we've got 2 concerns. One, of course, is survival, and the other concern, of course, is to be rescued. And we're sitting around and we're contributing to the conversation with each other around survival and also, getting rescued. Each of us sitting around that campfire would contribute in a certain way. There'd be a certain theme in the way we would contribute. For example, someone might say, well, look, let's go up to the top of that mountain and survey and just see what the lie of the land, where we're at and what's available to us on this island. Others would say, look, we need to make a very clear list of priorities in terms of what's important here over the next, say, 24 hours. Other people might say, well, look, I've seen movies about this, or I've read books about this, and the best course of action is X or Y. Others would want to organise people, and it goes on and on and on. So we would all have this contribution around the campfire, and each of those contributions, of course, would dictate the sort of role we like to play when we come together in a team. So it's a very interesting theory, and it's got a lot of validity when you consider the way people in your teams like to contribute in conversation during, say, your team meetings and how they contribute. And you can see, if you listen carefully, a very clear theme around how they like to contribute in those circumstances. So that's what we're covering. And what I do want to say to you now is that you can see that there are 2 hats basically that any team member wears. And the hats that people wear, well, there's a functional hat. Now, the functional hat is their job, basically. That's the technical requirements of what they're expected to do in the team, and everyone's got the job description and they've got the technical or the functional requirements. Now, in this Lunch and Learn series that we're covering, I, of course, haven't even gone there and won't go there in terms of functional requirements. You're the experts on that, and so are the people that are in the team. I'm not going to consider the functional hat. What I'm really interested in is the team members hat, which is the one on the right-hand side. And the team members hat is around the ability of that person to work with and through other people in the team. So you've got the functional hat, which is what I bring to the team in terms of my technical competence. And I've got the team members hat, which is my capacity to work with and through other people to be a team player. And it's the second one there that I'm really interested in, and this is where team roles come into play, that the team roles are really around that team member hat rather than the functional hat. All right, so we've always got that tension in the team between I'm coming to this as an individual with a set of functional responsibilities versus I am part of a team and willing to contribute in the conversation around team decisions. Now, I'm going to share with you a little bit about the team management systems methodology only because it's one that I'm very familiar with, and in my experience, it's probably the clearest one in terms of explaining people's roles. Now, if you've done a team management profile, this will make perfect sense to you, and if you haven't, I'm hoping it will anyway, if I explain it correctly to you. But the team management methodology is a pretty simple process. It's practical and it's been based on some research put together by an academic and an engineer. And what they were trying to do is to try and manage diversity in a team. And what I find really interesting in this day and age is that we talk about diversity, as we should in many respects. We need diversity in terms of male and female. We need diversity in terms of age. We need diversity in terms of thinking and education patterns and so on. And we talk a lot about this. But what's interesting is, and I think this will be the next big wave in terms of diversity, is that we don't really talk about how people like to contribute in teams. So I'm going to talk about managing diversity from a team role perspective today. The other thing that team management systems does very well is it generates a good understanding of how people like to contribute in a team. It helps develop a common language so that everybody's using certain terms that might be of interest. And of course, it's about developing optimal team performance. So there's a lot of things that the team management system methodology's got going for it. Now, the important thing about Meredith Belbin's theory about team roles and the work that's continued with team management systems and other systems out there is that these roles that people play are really their preferences. In other words, it's not about innate ability or anything like that. It's just how they look and view the world, how they see the world. And they contribute in these roles based on their own view of the team. So this is important because it's not about people's technical capacity, it's just about how their orientation is in relation to being part of a team. So it is based on a preferential model as such. Now, it's based on the 3P rule, actually, and some of you may have heard of the 3P rule, but it's a good little rule, and it goes like this. We tend to practice what we prefer, and because we practice what we prefer, we ultimately become proficient in it. So that's pretty much the methodology around Belbin's concept of team roles, that there's a tendency that we will contribute in teams depending on how we see the world, which is what we prefer. And then ultimately, because we see the world that way and we tend to contribute in that way, we ultimately become quite proficient in viewing things that way. So what it means for you as a team leader is that if you know what the roles are that people in your team display on a regular basis, your job is, wherever possible, to defer to them when you need that role to be exercised. So, for example, if you know that there's someone in your team who's very good at promoting, so in other words, they've got good stakeholders, good stakeholder relationships, they're natural networkers, and that's their natural ability, then when you want to promote the team's efforts to a wider community, the best person to talk to is the promoter in the team, someone who's got a natural desire to promote. And if you do that, then you're likely to get good results because that person's perhaps already thought about that before you have. Now, in the team profile that you do with team management systems, as I said before, it's very much based on Belbin's work, that there are actually 8 different tasks that are required to form any team project, and that each person has a contribution to make, not just in their technical expertise, but also in how they view the world, as I said before, their preferences. So what you find is that if you look on the right-hand side, you've got these labels, and these labels gives you a little bit of a hint at least on how people like to contribute in the team environment. And if you've got a team, for example, that has a lot of people that want to contribute in one or two particular ways, then you're probably going to find a team that gets on pretty well together because everyone thinks the same. But its a capacity to manage diversity will be challenged because there's only a couple of roles that have been covered. I have yet to see a team that's got every single one of these roles perfectly in alignment. So every team's got its opportunities for growth, which really centres around how we make sure that our role contributions that are in the majority don't dominate, and equally how the role contributions that aren't dominant aren't bypassed. So it's always a perennial challenge for a leader to do that. So you might like to think, well, where might I sit around the wheel? Now I'm going to help you with that because I'm going to define these 8 roles in the next few slides. And as I go through that, I'd like you to have a think, which of those roles sits well with me? Now, you need to put your team leader hat aside for a moment and just think about you being a team member. So even in your team leadership hat, you will still contribute in your role because you feel comfortable doing that, and it's likely you will. And you'll emphasize or overemphasize even that role. So let's have a look at each of those 8. And these aren't necessarily in order, it's just moving around the wheel in a clockwise fashion and starting with advising. So people who enjoy advising enjoy gathering and reporting information. So look, a typical example of someone that enjoys doing this would be someone who might make a contribution in a team, such as, I'll go and speak with the person concerned, find out what they want and report back at the next meeting. So they will be quite happy to go and investigate, to fathom what the person wants and to come back and let the team know. So advisors are people who like to advise are people who like to ask a lot of questions. They are naturally probably curious, and they will often ask people a bunch of questions, and you'll find that they're usually fairly value-based. A typical occupation, for example, that would be applicable here would be a journalist who will ask a whole lot of questions to get to the bottom of something, and then before they, of course, file their news report. So how interested are you in that? And I wonder whether there's somebody that you can identify in your team who actually has that particular role and has the ability to play that role on a consistent basis. Because you can understand that if a team doesn't have someone who's interested in advising, it's likely that the team aren't testing their assumptions and they aren't always clear about the quality of the information that comes through and filters through to the team. Now, the next role that people play in teams is the innovation role. Now, people who like, and I suppose it's fairly clear by the term what it actually refers to, but people who like to innovate have a tendency to create and experiment with ideas. So a typical comment that somebody who likes to innovate might make in a team meeting is, I'd like to suggest another way of tackling this issue that hasn't already been considered. Now, in local government, being a fairly compliant regulatory environment, it's not a natural attraction for somebody that has an interest in innovating. But nevertheless, I've known over the years many people in local government who are in fact very interested, who will question the status quo, who will challenge assumptions that are made, and they'll do that on the basis of being quite creative and innovative. So teams that have somebody that are interested in doing that, of course, can be perceived either as a pain in the backside, that people are always trying to reinvent the wheel, or they might be considered as a breath of fresh air depending on what the team's challenges are at the time. So have a think about yourself and the people in your team and whether or not you have somebody who has a natural inclination towards innovation. And I think that in our day and age now in local government, where we've got to think very much outside the box, promoting innovative thinking in a team environment is critically important, because otherwise we just keep doing and making the same old mistakes over and over again. So innovation is another role, another important role. Another important role in a team is, and I mentioned this one earlier, is the ability to promote. So these are people who will explore and they will present opportunities to colleagues. So a typical comment that somebody who has a role in this area might make in a team environment is they might say, well, we should sell the benefits of this approach to others before we go ahead and do this. So they're very mindful of the support base that needs to be marshalled. They're very mindful of the stakeholders associated with this, and they will remind the rest of the team of these things. And they're very important roles because no team works in isolation. That we've all got, we're all parts of a bigger picture. So, for example, if you are in a senior team, then the council that you address every fortnight or whatever it is, that council has a huge impact on your ability to do your job because they set the direction and a whole range of other things. So your ability to promote yourself, that is the team's promoting the team to council, is invaluable, and also of course to other pockets of the organisation as well. So that's another role that people play. Another role that people play is where people like to develop and assess. So these are people who will assess and test the applicability of a new approach. So they will often discuss whether or not something will work, and they'll often make comments in team meetings such as, before we commit to this, I think we should give it a trial run first and develop a plan B if it doesn't work. So they're always assessing and developing the application of a concept or an idea. So a team, and I remember working in a council where it was a senior team and we had 5 people out of the, it was 4 people out of 5 who had a strong role preference in the developing and assessing. So you can already imagine what their team meetings are like. They would be tossing around different ideas and thoughts and concepts and so forth, sometimes spending too long doing that. And in fact, their CEO was in fact a developer as well. So they were pretty keen to do all that and they encouraged it. The other person that wasn't actually a developer was an organizer, and they mentioned in the team meeting that they'd get very frustrated because other people would launch off into this sort of development phase and all the organizer wanted to do was to get on and get something done. So that became very interesting. We just got a question here, and it's a good question. Edward asks, in small remote councils, most team members are multi-skilled. Yes, but multi-skilled is different to role preferences. Multi-skilled is that technical hat that I mentioned before, Edward. So obviously in a small council, people are the jack of or Jill of all trades. They have to do all sorts of different things. But what I'm referring to here is their natural inclination to come to that meeting with a certain predisposition or a view, and they're not multi-skilled in that sense. So you've got these 2 separate hats. One is we'll pitch in and do everything together, which is what you're referring to, but there is the view when I come to the meeting how I might view the world. Now that's not a multi-skilled view, and it'd be good for you and others to know the people in your team and what sort of role they have and are willing to express. That's what I'm referring to. So we just need to be clear about that it's not just the fact that in a small environment, local government environment, that everyone can do everybody else's job. So that's the assessor, developer as a role, and moving around that wheel that I shared with you before, let's look at the next role preference. I mentioned this earlier, which is the organizing role. Now, people who like to organize will have a tendency to establish and implement ways of making things work. Now, for example, they will say things in a meeting like, I'd like to suggest we organise things this way. So they will be very keen to marshal all of the people in the team towards a plan of action. And in fact, I have a preference in this area, so I can speak quite confidently about this, that often when I'm in a meeting and I feel that there's a bit of a talk fest going on and we're not getting anywhere, I can't help myself. I will contribute in role by suggesting how we might organise ourselves moving forward. So that's the organising role. So you might want to think about whether that's you or whether there are other people in the team that are always constantly trying to organise everybody else. Now, as we move around the wheel, somebody's actually got to get the work done, or they've got to implement or suggest how the work be done. And these people, the producers, are the ones that are very much in the here and now, and they conclude and deliver on outputs. So they will say things like, before we move on, what exactly do you need me to do by the next meeting? So they're very keen to know what the tangible benefits or outcomes will be around the team output. So they're very, you could call them realists. They're not interested in the blue sky thinking. They're not interested in the strategy. They just want to know what needs to be done right now. And they'll get very, very stressed if there aren't tangible things that have to be achieved in the team environment. So they're important to teams because they're the ones who will bring the team back to the reality that something has to be done. We can't just keep talking about things. We have to actually get things done. Okay. The next one is the inspecting role. Now, the inspecting role is an interesting role because it tends to look backwards to make sense of the future. So the inspecting role is, I guess it could be a bit like an accountant in a way. Whoop, I went too far. Let me just go back. So these people are people who will control and audit the workings of systems, and they will be very keen to put key performance indicators around all of the team's tasks. So they'll ask questions in a team meeting like, how are we going to know that we are successful? Which is a good question. So they will want measurements in place to ensure that the team can monitor their progress towards a particular goal. So their role is very much to remind people in the team that they need to be achieving tangible outcomes with some measurement around it. All right, so I find that in local government, we're not short of people around that. And look, a good example of this would be if you were required to put a budget together, then the very first place that you would probably go in order to put a budget together would be to look at last year's budget and use that as a guidepost to be able to make or formulate a new budget for the following year. That's an inspecting role, okay, in a technical sense. But people who like to inspect will want to know what the KPIs are around the various elements. And finally is the maintenance role. Now, people who enjoy the role of maintaining will often, and you can see the car and looking under the bonnet, will have a tendency to try to uphold and safeguard the standards and processes that the team has bought into. So, for example, if your team has developed a team values charter, or the team's developed a set of values around how they do business, the maintainer role or the person in that role will have a tendency to remind team leaders what that role is or what those commitments were. So they'll say things like, didn't we all agree that we would meet fortnightly no matter how busy we got? We should all stick to those team commitments. So there's a tendency for them to remind the team of the commitments that they have made to each other as a team. It's kind of like the conscience of the team, if you like. So these people can be very valuable because they can keep the team true to themselves. So, folks, that's the 8 particular roles that are the most common in a team environment. And Belbin's model is pretty much based on those 8. It's just that this model, I think, that I'm sharing with you is a little bit more advanced. And so if people were formally doing a profile online, then what the questionnaire would do would be to determine which of those 8 roles were the most preferred. And the argument is if you prefer to do something, it's likely, as I said earlier, you'll do more of it. And ultimately, because you practice it more, you become proficient in it. So let me just try and summarize this a little bit so it makes a bit of sense for you in terms of the way you might look at things. So let's take those 8 roles and think about a problem that you might be resolving in your team and think about how you might apply those. The very first question that needs to be asked when the problem's plonked on the table in front of you as a team is this: what information do we need to resolve this problem? So you have a problem, you probably need to be able to access certain forms of information in order to be able to make a quality decision. So the advisors are the ones who would start to think about the information that they need to gather in order to help the team to contribute to a quality solution. The next big question that's got to be asked is, what are some ways of resolving this problem? Now, if there's a stock standard way of doing it, then of course this question will be answered very easily. But if this is a unique set of circumstances never been considered before, it might require a unique answer. So we might have some need for a creative or innovative response, depending on what it is. But nevertheless, the innovator will be thinking at this stage about ways and means of resolving this, perhaps that are original. The next key question that has to be asked when you're solving a problem in a team is, how can we communicate our recommendations to others to obtain the resources that we need? All right, now how do we do that? What's the process that we do that? How do we promote our particular cause so that we make sure that we have the resources we need? So the promoter starts to think about the stakeholders beyond the team and how they may reach out to them to help and assist in getting the resources that they need for the team's sake. The next set of questions are around developing the idea. So we've now started to get some ideas down. We now need to test the applicability of the ideas. So how do we test our ideas? Developers start to think about that. Then we need to start to organise ourselves into action once we've had a conversation about the way forward and we've developed it. So how do we establish a way of making this solution work is the next key question. And people who like to organise are the certain people that will start to ask those sorts of questions or make statements around organising people into action. So this is not about doing the work. This is about organising how the work will be done. And once that's been organised, the next key question that we've got to ask ourselves is, how do we deliver the results? What are the tangible things that have to happen in order for the team to effectively execute the strategy that they've come up with? So the producers are the ones, as I said earlier, who are the realists, who will be asking the tough question around what next? What do we need to do next? And then once we've started to put into action a set of steps, we then have to inspect our work. In other words, we've got to audit our success. And the next question we need to ask is, how do we measure our success? And people who are interested in the inspecting role will at least think, if not say, this is what we need to do next. And finally, we need to hold the whole thing together like glue. So the maintaining role will ask a question like, how can we maintain the team during this approach? How do we keep things together? How do we monitor ourselves as a team? How do we keep ourselves true to the job at hand? How do we remind ourselves of what needs to be done? So you can see that those 8 roles have a very important part to play in team success. The problem that I mentioned earlier is very real, is that some people in your team will have certain roles and other roles are perhaps missing. So just because you've got 8 people in a team doesn't mean that each person will neatly have one of these 8 roles. It's highly likely that 3 or 4 will have a particular role and another 2 might have another role, and maybe 1 more will have 1 more role, which essentially means that we've got a number of roles missing. And what that means is it's likely that the outcome of the team isn't going to be as effective as we might like, because we are missing certain questions that need to be asked in order to maintain the currency of the team. So that's the team role. So what I'd like you to do is to have a think about some of the people that you lead and think, well, where do they fit in? And I think if you give it enough thought, it won't be that difficult for you to work out where their particular role is. And likewise, it's not going to be too difficult for you to work out what you like doing and what your role is in the team, apart from being the leader of the team. Okay, now the question then is, how do we get these role preferences? Well, the most basic way, of course, is for you to just observe them in your workplace. But if you were doing it a little bit more scientifically, then there are a number of factors that come into play in order to orientate people towards a particular role. And I'm going to run through these with you briefly and then show you how they might work. So we have the concept of extrovert and introvert. And, you know, some people are introvert, in other words, they'll stick to their own company, and some people are extrovert and they enjoy the company of other people. We have how do people gather and use information. We have practical versus creative. Okay, and I'll talk a bit more about that too. And then the question is, how do each of us like to make decisions in the team? Some of us are analytical, while others are belief-based. You know, base our decisions on a set of values. And then how do we like to organise ourselves and others? People who are quite structured need a structure, and people who are quite flexible are quite happy to go with the flow. A lot of people, of course, will fall in the middle. So you've got a team. If you look at your team, you've got a mix of perhaps extroverts and introverts. Some are practical, some are creative, some are analytical, some are belief-based, some are structured, and some like to be operating in a very flexible way. So you've got to bring all that together and make sense of it. So what I might do now is just let's have a look at each of these continuums and consider the implications of them from a team leadership point of view. Okay, so let's take the first one, which is relationships. And if you think about it, we've got on the one end of the scale extrovert and the other end of the scale introvert. Now, there's a lot of rubbish that's written about this. All that extroversion and introversion actually really mean is how you recharge your batteries. How do you enjoy recharging your batteries when you're run down? Well, generally speaking, extroverts will tend to do this with and through other people. So they recharge their batteries by getting on the phone or going out and having a coffee or a drink or something. And introverts, on the other hand, will recharge their batteries by sticking their own counsel, going away quietly, thinking through the ideas and what was said during the course of the day. That's all it is. It's nothing more than that. And there's a lot of generalizations that people make that extroverts are more confident, and introverts are, have less people skills. All of these things, of course, are complete nonsense. The truth of the matter is it's just about energy, and it's just about how people like to recharge their batteries. But nevertheless, in a team environment, you'll have some extroverts and some introverts, and it's likely that sometimes there will be a puzzlement or even a clash because you don't quite get the other side. You don't understand, why is it the extroverts have to blurt things out? Why can't they think before they open their mouth? And the extroverts are looking at the introverts and thinking, why don't they speak up? Why don't they just get it off their chest? Why are they holding back? And of course, these things can be a source of frustration in a team environment as well. The next parameter is information. So we have people who are very practical versus people who are very creative. And people who are very practical can see the here and now. So, for example, if an email is sent out to someone that's highly practical, they will read it literally. So whatever the words are contained in the email, that will be the information that they will require. On the other hand, people who are quite creative will start to look at the email and start thinking questions around, I wonder why they wrote this. I wonder what was left out. I wonder what the real reason for this email is. And so they start questioning the email and what the positioning of it and the context of it, because they're quite creative. Well, both things are important. We've got to see what's actually in front of us, but on the other hand, it's useful to ask questions around why, and why is this being sent, and what are the implications of it, and so forth. So you'll find that, in terms of role preferences, you'll likely be one or the other in terms of the way you look at things. Then I guess what we've got to do is, have a look at this picture. I'm going to ask you to type in over on the question box what you see. So there's the picture, right? It's in front of you now. I want you to type in what you see, and when you've done that, I want to talk to you about whether it is a practical or a creative response. So go ahead, folks, and type in what you see, and I can give you an indication of how you see the world based on your comment about this question. Who wants to go first? Everyone's got paralysis by analysis, no doubt. So just type in, what do you actually see? And I'll give you an idea. Okay, all right, here's one. We have from David, who says, David says, I see 4 people in a doorway. Great. So is that a practical or a creative response? Well, obviously it is a practical response. They're looking at making sense of the facts as they see them. I have another one here from Edward, who says, leave me alone. Well, that's obviously a highly creative response, because what Edward is doing is he's making an interpretation of the scene to a point where there are inferences being drawn from it. Tracy says, I see a group of people standing in a doorway of an old building. They look as though they are considering and discussing a matter. So obviously, from Tracy's point of view, she's quite practical. So she's looking at it from a very practical perspective. All right, anybody else? Oh, I see. Kerry says, I see a person who is retreating from something and 3 others have stopped to help and support her. So you can see that Kerry is interpreting the information that's in front of her, and so therefore she's probably more likely to be creative rather than practical. You see, it's so interesting, isn't it, that all of us can see exactly the same information, whether that's an email or a painting or whatever it might be, and yet we will all come to it and we'll all arrive at it differently. We'll interpret it differently, and that's precisely what happens. So you can see that this is very real, and so we get an email and we will start to interpret that email in different ways, even though the information that's on the email is actually the same information for everybody. Everybody will look at it and see different things in it. So that's the practical and the creative response. All right, let's move on to the next one. So how do you like to make decisions? So we've got on the one end of the continuum people who like to make decisions based on analysis. So they like to crunch the numbers, in other words. And we have people who like to make decisions based on beliefs or values. Now, in local government, it's highly likely that the weightage will very much be around the analytical, because that's what you get paid to do, to crunch numbers, come up with options, and base your judgments on a well-founded plan. That's how decision making is done in local government generally. But here's something interesting. There's often a clash between councillors or elected representatives and staff, senior officers or officers, and the clash is because to go into public life, you need to have a set of beliefs. Because, I mean, very few people would do it if they had a choice, but obviously people who feel very strongly about the community, who have beliefs around that, will have a tendency to go into public life. But yet they're relying on officers who are quite analytical about how they come to arrive at decisions, because that's been their training. So you can see and understand why there'd be clashes in the council chambers, can't you, around belief-based versus analytical in a council environment. But of course, councillors would want their senior officers to be analytical, and I suppose arguably senior officers would want their elected representatives to be coming to that job with a set of beliefs that are critically important to them. So, Edward's asking, so do you mean like Ipswich and Logan? We won't go there. I won't talk about that, but thank you anyway for raising it. Yeah, but I mean, I'm making generalisations, as I'm sure you're aware, but I think when you come across really strong belief-based decision makers, there is a huge tendency for the belief-based decision makers to wear their heart on their sleeve. So they believe very strongly in a cause and a way forward, and they will stick to that no matter what. Whereas the analyticals will say, do the numbers stack up? If the numbers stack up, then I accept that and I'll go with it. So analytical versus belief-based is often a tension in a team environment. So have a think about the people in your team. How many, if any, of those people are actually belief-based decision makers? You kind of see that they've got a very set belief system. They'll often thump the table and say, that's not fair. And you say, why? And they say, because it goes against my beliefs. So in actual fact, a good decision-making body, any team, would have a mix of belief-based and analytical, not just one or the other. But most councils would be skewed towards analytical rather than belief-based. And this cartoon that will come up on your screen shortly really does depict what I'm talking about. And you can see there that the person on the left-hand side is very analytical. Look at how he is conducting his work. He's got lists on the wall. He's got payoffs versus pros and cons. He's trying to weigh things up as objectively as he possibly can. Whereas the person on the right, you can see their reading material, and you can see that what they're doing is basing their decision making on a set of beliefs or values. And this is not unusual, as I said earlier, that you can find elected representatives that will come to the work with a very belief-based agenda versus officers in council that can be quite analytical. And you might want to think that through when you're working with councillors. All right, look, this is a good way. I'm keen to hear your answer on this. So again, this is another little opportunity for you to get involved today. What I want you to do is to resolve this issue. Here it is, simple thing. You have 2 movie tickets to give away to your team, right? But you have 3 team members, right? 2 movie tickets, 3 team members. How do you decide who gets the tickets or who misses out? Just type in a response for me, please. How are you going to resolve this issue? Let's see what we come up with. And then we will have a discussion. So how will you resolve it? You've got 3 movie tickets and 2 movie tickets and 3 people, and you want to give out these tickets. So what will be the basis of the decision that you make about how you might do this? So just type in your response, and then we'll take a response away. So how will you do it? There's no correct answer, by the way, so I'm not angling. Here we go. I'd feel like giving it to those I'm closest with, but would in the end draw straws so nobody feels left out, says Kerry. Okay, so if you think about what Kerry said, is that she said at the beginning, I would probably feel inclined to give it to those that I feel closest with. That's very much a belief-based thinking. But then she's reverted to saying that I probably put them in a hat and give people a chance to draw them out. So what she's really doing is reverting to an analytical system, all right, even though perhaps she might have a predisposition towards a belief. All right, thanks, Kerry. Tracy says, the team members who have been the most productive, if they have all been productive, put their names in a hat and draw the names out. Yeah, well, that's very analytical. So what you're looking for is a criteria to make a decision about who you would reward with these tickets based on productivity. And if you couldn't separate people, it would be drawn out of a hat, which of course would be analytical as well. And Edward says make a draw, same sort of thing. So you're actually in a case where you're actually drawing out of a hat. So you can see that and every day you've got to make these sorts of decisions. You've got to come at each decision, and sometimes you've got to make hundreds of these decisions every day. And sometimes you don't think about the basis of what those decisions are, you just make them. And so are they analytical or are they belief-based, the decisions that you make as such? All right, and finally, before we finish up, is how do you like to organise yourself? Are you fairly structured or are you fairly flexible? I think the cartoon does sum this up next. So you can see the person on the left-hand side is quite flexible in the way they work, and the person on the right is quite organised and likes a lot of structure. And in local government, of course, you will find both styles of people. So you might want to think about the people that you lead and whether they're very structured or are they very flexible. And of course, your team overall will have a predisposition towards structure or flexibility. So having an agenda, for example, is a form of structure in your team as such. All right, and then just finally, before we finish up, unless there's any questions, you can actually, I've taken the names off people here so that we can protect them, but you can see that we've got the Ryder Scale here. We've got extrovert, introvert, practical, creative, analytical, belief-based, structured and flexible. And the people that are on there have been plotted on there depending on where their personal preferences are. So it gives the team a profile, and you can start talking to the team about their strengths and opportunities for growth. For example, an obvious strength in this team is look at the people over here who are highly analytical, right? So the strength of this team is that they're going to make decisions based on analysis, because that's how the people in the team generally like to make preferences. However, this person over here is a belief-based decision maker. And because they're a belief-based decision maker, they may feel isolated on certain decisions. And really the learning for this team, and I remember working with them, the learning for this team was to make sure that this person here was given a voice, because they were the only person that had an opportunity to have a different way of decision making. And it would have been very easy for a minority, such as this person, to be drowned out by the majority. And of course, another strength here is this team is very practical. But there are three people who are quite creative, and once again, it would be important to be able to harness or utilize those preferences as well. So you can see you can do a lot of things with this. It also shows the profiles of teams and the names of people and where they sit around the wheel. And you can see this team is very, very skewed on the right-hand side towards organising and assessing and producing. So this team has to be very careful that they don't spend too much time doing that at the expense of innovating and coming up with the right quality information and so forth. So there's lots of things that you can do with that that can be quite useful. So guys, that brings us to an end. What I want you to do is have some fun with this. I'd like you to observe your team this afternoon and think about how they communicate. So what are the preferences? You might even consider the 8 preferences that I gave you here and consider that using these preferences. So try to exercise those preferences. If you can give people an opportunity to contribute in their role preference, you'll find that you'll get great results, much better results. And of course, if you give people things that they don't feel comfortable doing or ask people's opinions where they don't feel comfortable expressing an opinion, you probably won't get the right sort of feedback or results that you want. So I'd like you to have a crack at that, and by all means send me an email, let me know how you go, which brings us to the end of our module 4, and next module 5 we'll look at conflict and negotiations in 2 weeks. So at this stage I'd like to say goodbye. Thank you, folks. I've enjoyed working with you. And thank you, Tracy. Great session. Have a good fortnight ahead. I appreciate that. And I'll see you in a fortnight. Thanks, guys, and all the best. And goodbye.